Good evening. As a member of the European Economic Association's Executive Council, I would like to welcome you all to the 13th Journal of European Economic Association, Fundación BBVA lecture. This series of lectures is made possible by the generosity of the Fundación BBVA, and we are grateful for their continued support. Over years, the lectures have become an important entry in the calendar of major economic lectures. Each year, the lecture is first delivered in January at the ASSA Meetings in the US, and in May, the lecture is given at the Fundación headquarters here in Madrid. Lecture is then published as a lead article in an issue of the Journal of European Economic Association in the following year. Consistent with the aims of the journal, the lectures are given in all fields of economics by leading scholars. Let me say a few words about the partner in this lecture series, the journal itself. Journal is now in its 16th years of existence. When it was established, the goal was to become a top general audience journal covering all areas of economics. I mean, we believe we have established this. The Journal of European Economic Association is now comparable to the best journals in economics on many quantitative measures. Let me now turn to the speaker of the day. Emmanuel Farhi is a professor of economics at Harvard University. He grew up in France and followed the footsteps of many other great French thinkers and attended the École Normale Supérieure. He then joined the PhD program at MIT and was awarded his PhD in 2006. Emmanuel's research focuses on macroeconomics, finance, international economics, and public finance. His papers appeared in leading journals in economics and finance. When I checked yesterday night, he had close to 8,000 Google Scholar citations, and for those of you in the audience who are not in academics, that's a big number. Emmanuel is a member of the Commission économique de la Nation in France, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and at the Center for Economic Policy Research. He's also a fellow of Econometric Society, and he has also not been shy from getting involved with actual policy and was a member of the Council of Economic Advisors to French Prime Minister. Over years, he won many distinctions. In 2009, he was awarded Barnesser Prize for the best European economist under age 40 by the Observatory of the European Central Bank. In 2011, Malimbo Prize by the French Economic Association. In 2013, Best Young Economist Prize by Le Monde. 2013, Banque de France and Toulouse School of Economics Prize in Macroeconomics and Finance. And in 2014, he was named one of the 25 best economists under age 45 by the IMF. Tonight's lecture is on one of the fundamental questions in economics with a long and colorful history. Under what conditions we can have an aggregate production function. The title of the talk will be the Microeconomic Foundations of Aggregate Production Function. And Emmanuel, the floor is yours for the next 75 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nazi, for this great introduction, and thank you to the BBVA Foundation for the invitation to deliver this lecture. The title is going to be The Microeconomic Foundations of Aggregate Production Functions, and it's joint work with my co-author, David Bakai, who is at the London School of Economics. So, aggregate production functions, it might sound like a bit of a dry topic, but as Nazi hinted in his introduction, it's a very fundamental topic, one that's very important for macroeconomics. And I will argue that it's a bit of a neglected topic, unfortunately. So aggregate production functions, which summarize the way an economy produces output from factors, are completely pervasive in modern macroeconomics. And we talk about a lot of the attributes of these aggregate production functions, like marginal products of factors, like factor demands, and elasticities of substitution between factors, such as the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor, for example. So these are very important objects that are discussed a lot. And when you think hard about it, they're really reduced form objects that we've come to treat as structural objects. So when we talk about the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor, that's something that we take to be some kind of structural primitive that's invariant to changes in the economy. And I will argue that if you really try to microfound aggregate production functions, you should not treat these objects as an invariant, as a structural parameter. And instead, you should try to understand how it's coming from the microeconomic parameters in the economy. So I think microeconomic foundations are needed for aggregate production functions to get these reduced form macro attributes from structural microeconomic parameters. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that these microeconomic parameters are easier to estimate than the macroeconomic parameters. And the reason for that is that at the micro level, we have a lot more sources of variations, a lot more natural experiments that we can plausibly exploit to identify these key parameters. Also, these, if we get the reduced form macro parameters from the micro parameters, the idea is that we get something more stable. Okay, so that when we do counterfactuals, for example, we can trust the model that we're building more instead of postulating an invariance of the reduced form macro objects to the counterfactual. On top of that, you get the other additional benefits of microfoundations that we usually get, which is that you can look at the macro impact of microeconomic phenomena. So imagine that you have a microeconomic shock to one particular sector or to a particular firm, and you're interested in its macroeconomic impact. Then you really need microfoundations in order to answer that question. And vice versa, if you want to look at the microeconomic consequences of aggregate phenomena, then you really need a model with microfoundation as well so that you can disaggregate what's happening in the economy. You can look at what's happening for different sectors, for different firms in a sector, and things like that. And this need for a microfoundation, which has always been there at some level, I think is becoming more pressing now for a very specific reason, which is that we have these newly available data sets at a much more granular, much more micro level that are becoming increasingly more available. And so the idea of building the macro from the grounds up, from the micro, really becomes a bit of a possibility. It becomes something that we can do and that we can discipline with microdata. Okay, so there's really, I think now, in order to tap into this increasing availability of micro data sets, a need for a theory that helps us map the micro to the macro and helps us use all this micro data to speak to macroeconomic phenomena. And that's where we hope to make a contribution, because we think that there's no general satisfactory theory of the macroeconomic foundations of aggregate production functions to date. I want to contrast this state of play with another big area of macroeconomics where the reality is very different. So if you go back to the old-fashioned models that people used to write in the 60s and 70s, the large-scale macroeconomic models, these were models that postulated reduced form aggregate relationships. So for example, you would have a production function and an aggregate consumption function and an aggregate investment function. And there's been a lot of work, a lot of progress in the past 40, 50 years to try to really disaggregate, to try to provide macroeconomic foundations for the aggregate consumption function and the aggregate investment function. So we now have a lot of models that are pervasive in macroeconomics that use heterogeneous agents instead of a representative agents and sort of build up the aggregate consumption function from the individual consumption functions of all the consumers in the economy. And that's led to very interesting work, a lot of progress that essentially studies nonlinear aggregation over this distribution of agents depending on their wealth and their shocks, and the study of the dynamics of these wealth distributions. And what I want to argue is two things. The first thing is that the same thing has not happened for production functions. So we're still very much in the realm of aggregate production functions or very sort of primitive degrees of disaggregation. And second, that the theory that's needed to provide the microeconomic foundations of aggregate production function is different from the theory that's needed to do the microeconomic foundations of aggregate consumption functions. So for aggregate consumption functions, what we need is really the study of these distributions, okay? Because agents, consumers interact in a few markets, the goods markets, the labor markets, and what's really crucial is to understand how these wealth distribution integrate and move over time. And something very different is needed on the production side, because firms interact in many more different ways than agents. Okay, firms buy and sell from each other. And so one thing that's absolutely key to understand a production is these production networks of firms buying and selling to each other, understanding these nonlinearities that arise from input-output linkages, which is not a problem that we face when we think about microfounding aggregate consumption function. So it's a very different theory that's needed to develop these microfoundations. Okay? It's basically a theory of networks, nonlinear networks and input-output linkages. And so that's what we're going to try to do today. Okay? So the goal is to provide relatively general microfoundations for aggregate production functions with an arbitrary number of sectors and maybe firms within sectors, so extremely granular model, an arbitrary number of factors. So it's not just going to be capital and labor, it'll have different forms of capital, different forms of labor, land, and things like that. You're going to have an arbitrary network of input-output linkages of firms buying and selling to each other, arbitrary patterns of microeconomic elasticities of substitutions, arbitrary returns to scale. You can have constant returns to scale or decreasing returns to scale at the micro level. An arbitrary set of frictions and distortions. So maybe there are frictions that impede the reallocation of factors from one firm to the other or from one sector to the other. And that's very important to understand the properties of aggregate production functions. And there will be also further generalizations that I'll hint to in the conclusion. It's part of a broader research agenda that I have with David. And these are a few papers that we've already written. And I'll come back to these papers in the conclusion. But basically, the message I'm trying to convey with this slide is that there's a lot to do. And we're very busy with the research agenda. And we're by no means the only one active in this research agenda. Actually, here is my related literature slide. I'm going to have to go relatively quickly because I have a lot of ground to cover. But you can see that we build on previous literature, some of them very old, some of them more recent. And there are a lot of researchers that are active in sort of this general direction that I outlined. So here's the outline of the talk for today. I want to start with a bit of a flashback to a colorful episode in the history of economic thought, which is called the Cambridge controversy, or the Cambridge capital controversy. So this is a controversy that took place in the 50s and 60s. It pitted Cambridge, US, where Harvard and MIT are, and Cambridge, UK, where Cambridge University is, and very prominent scholars of the time. And the issue of this controversy was precisely whether it makes sense to have an aggregate production function, and more precisely, whether we can build an aggregate capital stock or not. And it's the last time that these issues of aggregate production functions were really litigated in the profession. And I'll show you that after that, essentially the profession moved on to other topics. So I'll try to tell you a bit about that controversy, a bit about what the end of that controversy were, what the aftermath was, and then I'll try to argue that we're going to pick up from where the Cambridge controversy left and try to move on from there. Then I'll set up the exercise. I'll define the aggregate production functions and the aggregate cost functions, and you'll see under what conditions they can be defined. And then I'll move on to what is really the key contribution of this lecture, which is a characterization of these aggregate production functions and aggregate cost functions as a function of the microeconomic primitives. So what's going to be important are, all the details of the macroeconomic environment, the microeconomic elasticities of substitutions, the degrees of returns to scale, the ability to reallocate factors, the network of input-output linkages, And what we're going to do is to make clear how all these things matter for the determinants of the aggregate production functions. And I'll separate it into two characterizations, a first-order characterization and a second-order characterization. So imagine this aggregate production function. And there are a couple of properties of this production function that are first-order properties. By that I mean properties of the first derivatives of this production function. So think about the marginal products of factors, how productive factors, let's say capital and labor, are at the margin. The demand for factors, how much demand there is for capital and for labor as a function of the price of these factors, and aggregate productivity. Then I'll move on to a second-order characterization. The second-order characterization is properties that depend on the second derivatives of these aggregate production functions. So for example, macroeconomic elasticities of substitution, let's say the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor at the macro level, that's a second-order property of the aggregate production function. And we'll see that very different things matter for first-order properties and second-order properties. I'll talk a bit about frictions and distortions, walk quickly through an application of this theory to show you when disaggregation matters, and then conclude. So we're starting with the Cambridge capital controversy. And I want to start with a quote from Joan Robinson, who was one of the very prominent actors in this controversy. So she was based in Cambridge, UK. And together with Sraffa and Pasinetti, they mounted an attack on the aggregate production function immediately after Bob Solow published his famous article on economic growth using an aggregate production function. Okay, and that attack was motivated on many different grounds. Partly it was ideological. It was mounting an attack on the marginalist conception of the return to capital, with the idea that, you know, there is such a thing as the competitive return to capital, and they were arguing against that. So they were, I think, motivated partly by ideology, but they ended up making a theoretical and a methodological point. And that theoretical and methodological point was actually well taken. And you'll see that the Cambridge US sites, which initially resisted these attacks, ended up conceding that theoretical and methodological point. So I'll focus my coverage of the Cambridge controversy on this, on the theoretical and methodological aspect. So what Robinson was attacking is the concept of an aggregate capital stock. And here's what she says. The production function has been a powerful instrument of miseducation. The student of economic theory is taught to write Y equals F of KL, where L is a quantity of labor, K is a quantity of capital, and Y a rate of output of commodities. He is instructed to measure L in man-hours of labor. He is told something about the index number problem involved in choosing a unit of output, and then he is hurried on in the hope that he will forget to ask in what units K is measured. Before he ever does ask, he has become a professor, and so sloppy habits of thought are handed from one generation to the next. So she's arguing against the idea of K in F of KL, okay? And let me elaborate a bit on this. And to do this, I will take from Samuelson, who was a very active participant in this controversy on the Cambridge US side, together with Bob Solow. So Samuelson explains that there are three key parables that he associates with neoclassical writers, and that are associated with aggregate production function. So the first one is that the rate of interest is determined by a technical property. So the rate of interest is determined by the marginal product of capital. And the marginal product of capital is a technical property. Okay, so you have a link between finance and macro. The second property, the second parable, is diminishing marginal returns to capital. So it's the idea that as you increase the interest rate, the capital output ratio and the capital labor ratio is going to go down. The third one has to do with the distribution of income, and it's the idea that the relative rewards of capital and labor reflect the relative scarcities of capital and labor. So the ratio of the wage to labor, to capital and the wage to labor is a decreasing function of the relative abundance of these factors of the capital-labor ratio. And you can see that all of these properties follow once you postulate an aggregate production function. In that sense, aggregate production functions capture the intuitions of neoclassical writers. But crucially, and that's the whole point, in some sense, of the Cambridge capital controversy, it relies on a physical interpretation of capital. So you need to be able to interpret capital as a physical thing, okay? And this is not what the capital stock reflects, for example, in the Solow model. It's an aggregate of very heterogeneous forms of capital. So you have buildings and machines and things of that sort, okay? And because these things are heterogeneous, they're not measured in the same units. You cannot easily aggregate buildings and machines. You need to use prices to do that, valuations. So the aggregate capital stock is a valuation aggregate that's built using prices. It does not have a physical interpretation. Hence, we cannot take for granted the three key parables of neoclassical writers. Okay? Now, what is the culmination of the Cambridge controversy? So Samuelson, in 1966, publishes an article in the Quarterly Journal of Economics where he concedes to the Cambridge UK side and says, you're right, we can't write an aggregate production function with an aggregate capital stock. And what he writes is a model with reswitching or capital reversing. So I'm going to walk you through this model. That will be helpful to understand what he meant by this. And it will be helpful to understand also maybe why that conclusion wasn't as impactful as it should have been. So what they ended up using, what Samuelson ended up using, is called an Austrian circulating capital model that can be traced back to the Austrian school, to Hayek and Böhm-Bawerk. And it's actually extremely simple. So he's saying, I'm going to assume that the capital stock is not this homogeneous thing. In fact, there are different techniques. And he's going to use the simplest possible number of different techniques, 2. So the first technique is as follows. In order to get output at T, then you need to invest 2 units of labor at T minus 2 and 6 units of labor at T. Okay, so if you combine 2 units of labor at T minus 2 and 6 units of labor at T, you get 1 unit of output at T. That's technique 1. The second technique requires you to use 7 units of labor at T minus 1. And once again, you get 1 unit of output at T. So the key thing is to understand which technique is going to be used as a function of the interest rate. You can see that technique 2 is going to dominate when the interest rate is very high because the delays that are involved in technique 2, which are longer than in technique 1, which are shorter, sorry, the delays that are involved in technique 1 that are longer than in technique 2 are very costly when the interest rate is very high. Okay? So 2 is going to dominate technique 1 when the interest rate is very high. Similarly, when the interest rate is very low, the only thing that matters is not when the labor is expensed, but the total labor requirement. Okay? And when the interest rate is very low, technique 2 is going to dominate again because it has a lower total labor requirement than technique 1. It's 7 versus 8 units. And in between, for intermediate levels of interest rates, you're going to use technique 1. So as you increase the interest rate, you're going to start using technique 2, switch to technique 1, and then reswitch to technique 2. And these reswitching between the 2 techniques are going to lead to violations of the parables. Okay, so the capital labor ratio and the capital output ratio, for example, are not going to be decreasing functions of the interest rate. Hence, you could not possibly represent this economy with an aggregate production function that uses as its argument the aggregate capital stock. So here is an the graphical example of what happens in this economy. And you can focus on the 2 left panels, bottom and top. And it shows you the capital output ratio for the top left panel and the capital labor ratio for the bottom left panel as a function of the interest rate. And as you see, you're using first technique 2, then technique 1, then technique 2 again as you increase the interest rate. If you're within a technique, the capital output ratio and the capital labor ratio is decreasing, it's monotonic. But when you switch from one technique to the other and you reswitch, you get these non-monotonicities. So this is an economy that you cannot represent with an aggregate production function with the aggregate, with the argument being the aggregate capital stock. It violates the three parables of neoclassical writers. Okay? So what should we make of this? There's a very interesting aftermath of this controversy. Very interesting because the Cambridge US side ends up conceding to the Cambridge UK side. And yet you'll see that to some extent the history stops there. And we're going to try to pick it up where they left. So here's a quote from Samuelson, which tells you what his reaction to the whole controversy was. So he took it very seriously. And he has this wonderful quote. He says, "Pathology illuminates healthy physiology." Okay, so this reswitching example, which is this exotic, maybe pathological example, shows you that you can't do it. And for him, that's it. If you can't do it in a particular case, it means that your theory is problematic and you need to fix the theory. And he goes on to say, if this causes headaches for those nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical writing, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. So he thinks we should take this seriously and start writing these aggregated models. Solow has a much more ambiguous reaction to the Cambridge controversy. So he has these answers, which is like there are two ways to respond to the Cambridge capital controversy. You can go highbrow. Highbrow is the Samuelson answer. Okay? You take it seriously, you really need to do the theory. Or you can go lowbrow. Lowbrow is to say, I don't want to bother with this. This is too complicated. Aggregate production functions are too convenient. Let me just do empirical work with that. And I'll do a lot of great things. And he was ambiguous. He says, myself, I'm middlebrow. Okay? And this last quote, which I'm not going to read to you, is a quote by Samuelson making fun of the ambiguities of Bob Solow. But what's very interesting is that, so you have this concession, it's clear to everybody that aggregate production functions are not very well founded in theory. But there's this disagreement on whether it's a curiosity or it's a deep problem. Okay? So Samuelson thinks it's a deep problem, Bob Solow is more ambiguous, and a lot of other people think it's just a curiosity and we should just move on. So aggregate production functions keep being used for empirics. There's a short detour with a sort of a general equilibrium approach, which is even called the MIT school, because you have generations of MIT grad students that try to write disaggregated production models, but it sort of doesn't lead to anything very satisfactory. And then after that, you have the RBC revolution, which leads to the quasi-universal adoption of aggregate production function, and this controversy and the issues that are associated with it recede in the background, and everybody forgets about it. And to a large extent, that's a turning point in the macro profession, because we move from macro being about heterogeneity and aggregation to macro being about dynamics and expectations. Okay? So our starting point is basically to try to pick up the quest for aggregate production function where the Cambridge controversy left the issue. We're going to move away from the specific angle through which they tackled the question, which was whether or not you can define this aggregate capital stock. You can't. They came to this answer. Okay? So we're going to accept that. And to accept that whenever you want to write aggregate production functions, you have to accept to disaggregate factors as much as they need to be disaggregated. So we're going to allow for many different forms of capital, many different forms of labor, land, and things like that, because any theory of aggregate production function needs to do that. But the key thing that we're going to go after, that the Cambridge controversy left completely untouched, is the characterization of how this aggregate production function looks like as a function of microeconomic primitives when it exists. So let me now set up the framework that we're going to be using to do this. So I'm going to allow for a little more specificity than I need. I can work with a more general model, but it's going to be very general already, and it's going to include like most of the macro models that you would see written nowadays as particular cases, and previous attempts at microfounding aggregate production function as particular cases, like Huthacker, for example. So it's going to be a very general nested CES economy. So CES means constant elasticity of substitution. It's a very convenient functional form. And nested CES means that you're going to imbricate these CES nests into one another. So for example, you could have a microeconomic production function for airplanes that uses materials and skilled labor and unskilled labor and capital, okay? And these things could have different elasticities of substitution between each other. They would enter through different CS nests in the language that we're going to be using, okay? So a very general arbitrary nested CS structure with very rich patterns of elasticities, and they can be very different from one producer to another, and an arbitrary number of nests. An arbitrary number of sectors or firms within sectors, arbitrary numbers of factors, and no restriction on the input-output linkages between the firms. So as I argued, the thing that's key, in my opinion, to microfirm aggregate production function is to really tackle the issue of intermediate goods. The idea that firms are using the goods from other firms as intermediate inputs in order to produce. And so you need to characterize how this production network is working, okay? And we're going to assume for the talk constant returns to scale. We can easily handle decreasing returns to scale using a trick that's well known in general equilibrium theory of introducing quasi-fixed factors. And so that's going to be the economy. Then we're going to have a bunch of shifters, which are going to be sectoral productivities and factor supplies or factor prices, depending on whether we work with an aggregate production function or an aggregate cost function. So I need to introduce a few objects in order to characterize these aggregate production functions. And the complications really come from trying to deal with the input-output structure. Okay, and that's why we're going to need a little bit of notation. So the first thing to note, and it's something that we're going to take advantage of, is that if you have these nested CS economies, you can always blow up the nests and relabel the network such that each node in the network corresponds to one CS nest. Okay? And so that means that each node is associated with one elasticity. And this is without loss of generality. You can always rewire the network in that way. You can always transform the network in that way. It's the same underlying economy. So now take an economy that's written in that form, and you can write the input-output matrix. So an input-output matrix, omega ij, measures how much the exposure of I to j as a function, as a fraction of the revenues of I. So how much I is spending on j as an intermediate input as a function of the revenues of sector I. It's a notion of exposure of I to j. This is the input-output matrix from which you can build a Leontief inverse matrix, which is just given by the infinite sum of the powers of the input-output matrix. So the input-output matrix, the direct exposure of I to j. But there are many ways of being exposed to I, to j, either directly or indirectly through the network, through k or through k and l or through k, l, and m. And the different sums in this infinite series are representing all these different ways of being exposed indirectly to j through the network. So the Leontief inverse matrix, psi ij, is going to measure the direct and indirect exposure of I to j through the network, okay, going through other producers. Because maybe I is exposed to k and k is exposed to j. So I is exposed to j indirectly through k. So that would be a chain of length 2. But you have chains of length 3, of length 4, etc. Okay, and this is all encoded in this psi ij. The last object we're going to need is these Domar weights. And these Domar weights are just very simple objects. They're the sales shares of the different producers. So you take producer I, you look at its sales, and you report these sales as a fraction of GDP. Okay? It's called the sales share or the Domar weight. And for factors, we're going to use capital letters instead of, so I will write big lambda f instead of little lambda f when it comes to factors. So how are we going to define the aggregate production function? So imagine that you have an economy and you have a number of factors, L1 to LQ. And then you have all these different producers, you have n producers, and there can be productivity shocks for each of these producers, A1 to AN. So I'm going to write the aggregate production function as the maximum level of output that you can get in this economy by allocating factors and intermediate goods as efficiently as possible. So you try to maximize aggregate output subject to market clearing for factors and for goods. Okay? So you can always define this object, and you need to have a lot of factors. Okay? So two factors that are not perfect substitutes should enter as separate arguments in this production function. Okay? So for example, capital that's in the form of, let's say, buildings, and the capital that's in the form of plants are two different forms of capital. They are not perfect substitutes, should be two different arguments, two different factors in this production function. You can also define an aggregate cost function. It's the dual of the aggregate production function. And instead of taking the factor supplies as given, you take factor prices as given. Okay, so R1, R2, RQ are the prices of the factors. And we're going to take these factor prices as given and try to minimize the cost of producing one unit of output subject to market clearing and subject to factor prices being given by R1 to RQ. So you can always define this aggregate cost function. Okay. Now, we're going to give in this lecture a characterizations of these aggregate production function and aggregate cost functions. I'm going to start with the aggregate cost function because it's easier, okay? Because taking factor prices as given is going to short-circuit some of the general equilibrium forces that we're going to have to take care of when we take instead factor supplies as given. And I'm going to split this characterization into two categories. First order characterization, the first moments of the production functions, the derivatives, and the second order characterization, the second moments, the second derivatives. So the first order is going to be relevant for things like marginal products of factors, factor demands, aggregate productivity. The second order characterization is going to be important for elasticities of substitution between factors. So for the first order characterization, there's this remarkable result that's due to Chuck Holton. It's a macro envelope condition that tells you that you can characterize the first derivatives of the aggregate production function and the aggregate cost function. The only thing you need to know about the economy are these sales shares. So you need to know the sales shares of the individual producer, and you need to know the factor shares, so the labor share, the capital share, and things like that. And if you know this, you know the aggregate production function to the first order, and you do not need to concern yourself with the details of the production structure. You don't need to know microeconomic elasticities of substitution. You don't need to know input-output linkages. You don't need to know the degree of returns to scale. You don't need to know if it's easy to reallocate factors across producers. All these things are irrelevant to the first order. There's a sufficient statistic, which is the distribution of sales shares. Okay? So for example, the elasticity of aggregate output to the supply of one of the factors is given by the share of that factor. Okay? So for example, the elasticity of aggregate output to labor is given by the labor share. The elasticity of aggregate output to a form of capital is given by that capital share, and things like that. Similarly, if you want to know how aggregate output responds to the productivity of a particular producer, it's going to be given by the sales share of that producer. Okay? So the sales share, which are very easy to observe quantities, is the only thing that matters. Okay? And all the details, all the structure that I told you about up to now is irrelevant to the first order. So it's a remarkable aggregation result. Okay? There's the same thing for aggregate cost functions. Okay? So you can characterize the first derivatives of aggregate cost functions in the same way. So the hard work to do is really the second order characterization. If you want to know things like what's the macroeconomic elasticity of substitution between capital and labor, you'll see that it depends on all these things that the first order did not depend on. It's going to depend on input-output linkages, on macroeconomic elasticities of substitution, on returns to scale, on the ability to reallocate factors. Okay, and I'm going to try to spell out this mapping. Okay, so I'm going to start by showing you what I'm going to call propagation equations. So, okay, so it's a lingo that it seems like it comes from physics, but that's a bit the vision that we have. Okay, it's a very disaggregated economy with lots of different producers that are interconnected, and you want to know how shocks propagate in this network. And how shocks propagate is going to be governed by propagation equations, which are going to tell you how the shares of the different producers change when you have a shock in the system. And once you have these propagation equations, we're going to be able to characterize the second order properties of aggregate production and cost function, the Hessian. And we're going to be able to characterize macroeconomic elasticities of substitution. Okay? So I'm going to start with aggregate cost functions because it's a little easier, and I'll do aggregate production functions later. So here are these propagation equations for the cost function. So again, we're taking an economy where we have a bunch of factors. We're not taking factor supplies as given, we're taking factor prices as given. So you know the price of labor, you know the price of capital, and you're asking, well, what's the minimal cost way of producing one unit of output? How should I allocate the labor and the capital, and how should I allocate the intermediate goods in this economy to produce in the least possible cost way? Okay. Now, take an economy like this and introduce some shocks. Okay? And the shocks could be shocks to the factor prices. It would be the D log RGs in this expression. Or the shocks could be to the productivities of the different producers, the D log AKs in this expression. Okay? So the first line is giving you a set of equations that's telling you how the factor shares are changing. Okay? And the second line is telling you how the shares of the different producers in the economy are changing. And you see that these expressions have a similar form for factors and for producer. And what they do basically is that they mix properties of microeconomic elasticities of substitutions. These are the theta j minus 1. And properties of the network of the economy, the input-output linkages. These are the omega j's and the psi k's and the psi f. So I'm going to try to give you some intuition for this formula. The only thing I want you to note at this stage is the sort of ingredients that show up in there. You see that to characterize how these factor shares are moving and how the shares of the different producers are moving, I need to know the elasticities of substitutions, the theta j's minus 1 at the micro level. I need to know input-output linkages, okay? I need to know the omega j's, and I need to know the psi k's and the psi f's. And this is through this formula, okay, that all these quantities are going to matter for the second-order properties of aggregate production function, and for very concrete things such as elasticities of substitution between capital and labor. So let me zoom in on one of these terms. So I'm assuming that there's a shock to the cost of factor G. Okay? So factor G, which could be labor, for example, the price of that factor increases. And what we want to know is how the factor shares of all the other factors, including factor G, are moving when there's a shock to the price of factor G. So you see that what you have to do is a sum over all the nodes in the network of a quantity that's going to combine an elasticity of substitution, theta j, and a quantity that's going to combine properties of the input-output linkages of the production network. That's the term that's underlined here. Okay? So I'm going to zoom in on one of these terms for producer J, but you need to do the sum of all the producers in this economy. So the sort of things that I'm going to describe now is going to take place at every node in the network. So imagine that the factor G is becoming more expensive. What I've represented here is a producer, J, and the different inputs that get into J. Okay? So some of them are factors, and some of them are intermediate inputs from other producers. And these different input branches are going to be exposed to the shock, to the increase in factor G, differentially, potentially. Okay? Which means that when the price of factor G increases, the prices of all these intermediate inputs is going to increase, but not by the same amount. So some inputs are going to become much more expensive, and some mildly more expensive. This exposure of the input branch to to the shock is captured by psi g. Okay? So what matters is psi g d log rg. That's how much the price of these different input branches is going to increase when there's an increase in the price of factor g. Now imagine that the elasticity of substitution for producer J is greater than 1. So the inputs are substitutes. Then I'm going to substitute away from the branches that are becoming more expensive. Okay? Away from the branches that are more exposed to the shock to factor G. If these branches were also more exposed to factor F, then I'm going to substitute away from branches that demand a lot of factor F. That means that the share of factor F is going to go down. Okay? So that's why what matters is whether the elasticity of substitution is greater than 1 or less than 1. It's going to tell you whether you're going to substitute in one direction or the other. And it matters what the covariance is between the exposure to G and the exposure to F is for the different input branches. And this covariance is evaluated according to a probability distribution, which is just a column of the input-output matrix. And it sums up to 1 by construction because the sum of the shares is going to sum up to 1, so you can interpret it as a probability distribution. So hopefully you get the general idea that when you have a shock to the price of a factor, that is going to trigger changes in relative prices. These changes in relative prices are going to trigger patterns of substitution in the network. And as you substitute, you're going to substitute in a way that increases your demand for factor F or reduces your demand for factor F. And that's what's going to determine whether and how much the share of factor F increases. So we call this the input-output covariance operator. And it's a centrality measure that mixes elasticities of substitution and properties of the network. Okay? And these substitutions are happening at all the nodes in the network. Now, if you have these share propagation equations, for which I just gave you the intuition, you actually have the full characterization of the aggregate cost function up to the second order. So you know the second derivative, you know the Hessian of the aggregate cost function. Okay, for example, if you want to know the cross partial of the cost function with respect to RF and RG, it's given by the derivative of lambda F with respect to RG, the elasticity, the semi-elasticity of the share of factor F to the price of factor G. And similarly for the other elements of the matrix of second derivative of the cost function. Okay, so these share propagation equations and this, the second derivative, the Hessian of the aggregate cost function, encode exactly the same information. You can go from one to the other. So if you've characterized the share propagation equations, then you know what the second order properties of the aggregate cost function are. Okay? And they depend on all these things that I told you about. Okay? Unlike the first order properties, they depend on microeconomic elasticities of substitution. They depend on the properties of the network. They depend on the degrees of returns to scale. They depend on whether or not factors can be reallocated. From this cost function, you can also read the macroeconomic impact of microeconomic shocks. So imagine that you have a shock to I, okay, and you want to know how much that's going to increase the aggregate cost function. Well, to the first order is given by the sales share, and to the second order is given by the derivative of the sales share. And we've characterized the derivative of the sales share using the propagation equation. Okay? So that allows you to characterize the macro impact of micro shock, not just the first order impact, but the second order impact, the nonlinearities that are involved in the propagation of shocks. And these nonlinearities can be very important. For example, I hope to be able to show you towards the end of the talk the impact of an oil shock on the economy. And there's a bit of a puzzle because oil is a relatively small sector in terms of sales shares, yet increases in the price of oil, we think that they have relatively large effects on the macroeconomy. And it's not something that you can understand if you neglect these nonlinearities. So you really need to take into account these second order and higher order terms. From that, you can also understand the properties of macroeconomic moments of GDP. Okay, you can think about the standard deviation, the skewness, the kurtosis of GDP. These are all properties that are going to be shaped by the nonlinearities in the system, and these nonlinearities are characterized by these derivatives. So here's a very concrete example that will illustrate this logic. It's an example where you have two, it's a universal energy example. Okay, so think of E as electricity or oil. So it would be a sector that has a relatively small share, but it's going to be very important in a way that I'll make clear. So there are two factors in this economy. There's electricity or oil and labor. Then you have a bunch of downstream sectors, 1 through n, and these sectors use electricity and labor. But they don't all use electricity and labor in the same way. So the first M sectors are using both electricity and labor, and the next sectors are using only labor. So electricity enters only in the first M sectors, but not in the sectors that follow. This formula here is telling you the second derivative of the aggregate cost function with respect to a change in the cost of electricity. So imagine that the price of oil goes up, then what's going to happen to the aggregate cost function? Okay, and that's going to be related to how much the share of electricity is going to go up as a response to the increase in the price of electricity. And that's going to depend crucially on the elasticities of substitution. So you have two elasticities of substitution here, sigma and epsilon. Sigma is the elasticity of substitution between the downstream producers. So the consumer is substituting between these different intermediate producers according to a relatively high elasticity of substitution, sigma. And then epsilon is the elasticity of substitution in production between electricity and labor for any given intermediate good producer. Okay? And that elasticity, we're going to think about it as being very low. So there are lots of complementarities. We're very close to Leontief at the microeconomic level, but there are lots of possibilities to substitute at the macroeconomic level. Okay, so sigma greater than epsilon. So what you see here is that epsilon is going to matter only if m is different from n. Okay, so if electricity enters in the production of all these downstream producers, okay, then because it enters symmetrically everywhere, there's no possibility to substitute at the micro level. Okay, so this epsilon is going to be, sorry, what am I saying? Let me restart. You see that if sigma is equal to epsilon, then you get this formula over here. Okay, so if sigma is equal to epsilon, you get a formula that tells you that what matters to the second order is elasticity substitution minus 1, and then the share of electricity. So the impact is going to be bigger if the share of electricity is neither too small nor too large to the second order. Okay? If it's too small, then you're shocking a trivial part of the economy, so it doesn't have much of an impact. If it's too big, then there's no real possibility to substitute. Okay? So that's why it enters in that way. But now, suppose that epsilon is less than sigma, and suppose that electricity enters, let's say, everywhere first. Okay. So because electricity is going to enter everywhere in all these downstream producers, okay, then there's going to be no possibility to substitute at the macro level, because every producer is going to be hit in the same way. Okay, so the only thing that's going to matter is the elasticity of substitution at the micro level. It's going to be epsilon, and it's a relatively low elasticity of substitution. So if electricity is a universal input in the sense that it enters everywhere, then the share of electricity is going to go up very quickly when the price of electricity goes up, and the cost is going to go up very quickly. So an output is going to go down very quickly. Okay, so you're going to have bigger nonlinearities. Now, if electricity does not enter everywhere, so imagine a different input, okay, that would not be as pervasive as energy, then you have a possibility, as the price of electricity is shooting up, to substitute at the macro level. Okay, the price of the intermediates that are hit by electricity is going to go up, and you're going to substitute towards the producer that are not using electricity. And that's going to mitigate the impact of the shock to electricity. So you're going to have a much less of an impact in that case. Okay? So this is a universal energy example which is telling you that one thing that's special about energy, okay, is that not only it's hard to substitute at the micro level, but it's hard to substitute at the macro level because it enters everywhere. And I'll show you that empirically it looks like this. I'll compare oil and retail. These are two sectors that have approximately the same size. So to the first order, shocks to oil and shock to retail should be equivalent. But you'll see that oil is much harder to substitute at the macro level than retail. And so negative shocks to oil are going to have a much bigger impact than negative shocks to electricity. And this is really about microeconomic elasticities of substitution and the position of this sector in the network. You need to know all these properties to understand how the macroeconomy is working. So I've talked a lot about macroeconomic elasticities of substitution between factors. So let me try to define these objects now and to tell you how to compute them from the quantities that I've shown you already. When you have more than two factors, it's actually non-trivial to define elasticities of substitutions. And people have been, there's a large literature that tries with different concepts of macroeconomic elasticities of substitution. We're going to use one of them that we think makes sense, but you could use other ones. And it's called the Morishima elasticities of substitution. So here how you define the Morishima elasticity of substitution between two factors, F and G. You say, what happens when I change the relative price of factor F and G? How much does the relative demand for factor F and factor G changes when the relative price of factor F versus factor G changes? And this is encoded in this elasticity. An equivalent way of defining this elasticity is to ask how the relative factor shares of F and G are changing when I change the relative price of factor F. So that's the definition that we're going to be using for macroeconomic elasticities of substitution. And you'll see that we can compute this object based on the propagation equations and the properties of the production function. A few things about these Morishima elasticities before I tell you how to do that. If you assume, as a lot of people do in modern macro, that you have a nested CS aggregate production function. So you don't do the sort of things that I'm advocating in this lecture. Instead, you postulate an aggregate production function that is nested CES. Then you get the following properties. The Morishima elasticities, they're not necessarily symmetric. This is something that you have to give up on when you have more than two factors. You get that sigma Fg is going to be a weighted average of the different elasticities in the different nests. And you get that if two factors are within one nest, then the elasticity of substitution between these two factors is the elasticity of substitution of that nest. So in some sense, Morishima elasticities of substitutions is the right concept if you think about CS. It has advantages over other notions of elasticities of substitutions that I'm not going to get into. Now, you can give a general characterizations of these elasticities of substitutions as a function of the propagation equations that I gave you. Okay? Why? Because we know, we've characterized how the shares of the different factors are changing when there's a shock to the price of one of the factors. That's precisely the answer that the propagation equation is giving. Okay, so we know that mapping, and we know how it depends on all the microeconomic primitives in the environment. So we can compute, by taking the difference between two of these equations, how the relative factor shares between F and G changes when there's a shock to the price of factor F. So we can readily compute these macroeconomic elasticities of substitutions from the propagation equations. Okay? And it's these macroeconomic elasticities of substitution, they summarize exactly the same information as the Hessian, as the matrix of second derivatives of the aggregate cost function. So there are a few general properties that you can prove. It's non-symmetric in general. It's a weighted average of the underlying microeconomic elasticities. Okay? And the weights on the different microeconomic elasticities are going to be functions of the input-output linkages, of the properties of the network. Okay? And we can also show that there is a bit of a network irrelevance result that pops up when you have uniform elasticities of substitution. So imagine you have an economy where all the elasticities are the same. In that case, all the Morishima elasticities of substitutions are equal to this one microeconomic elasticity of substitution, this one number theta. And in that particular case, the network doesn't matter. And this follows directly from this, because the Morishima elasticities of substitutions are weighted average of the underlying elasticities. So if all the elasticities are the same, then you know that the Morishima elasticity is equal to that same elasticity number. So we can go back to this energy example and compute the Morishima elasticity of substitution between energy and labor. Okay? And you can see here that it's given by a weighted average of these two elasticities, and you can see exactly what the weights are and how much they're going to load on sigma and how much they're going to load on epsilon. And in particular, you see that if energy is a universal input, so if energy enters everywhere, then m is equal to n, and this weight is equal to 0. So all the weight is on epsilon. And if m is smaller than n, then there are possibilities to substitute at the macro level, and we start putting some weight on the higher elasticity of substitution on sigma. Now I want to move to aggregate production functions. So in order to do that, I have to write propagation equations for slightly different economies, where instead of taking factor prices as given, I'm going to take factor supplies as given. So it's the dual. So you see these propagation equations, and don't stare at them too much. They have roughly a similar form. There's one difference. This one difference is, you look at the first equation, the second line in this equation. That's the new term. So you see that now, in order to know how the share of factor F is changing, I need to know how all the other factor shares are moving. In other words, I have to solve a system of equations. Why is that the case? It's the case because when you have a shock in this economy, let's say to the supply of one of the factors or to one of the productivities, then this shock is going to trigger patterns of substitutions exactly along the lines that I told you before. But as we trigger these substitutions, we're going to increase or decrease the demand for the different factors. And if we do that, we're going to change relative factor prices. And now these changes in relative factor prices are going to trigger another round of substitution in the economy, which again is going to change relative factor prices, etc. So you have to solve a fixed point, basically. And that's what this system of equation is doing. But that system of equation has exactly the same form as the equations I showed you before. It's really about substitutions and these covariances. That's what pops up everywhere. And that's the only thing that I wanted to convey with this slide. There's an interesting property about the propagation of shocks in the first type of economy and this type of economy, which is that in the first type of economy, shocks propagate only downstream. It's all about whether the prices of the other producer that use you is going to change as a response of the shock that you're experiencing. When you have fixed factors, like in this economy, shocks are going to propagate upstream and downstream. Okay, because a shock is going to trigger changes in relative factor prices, which are then going to propagate again and everything. So you have two-way patterns of substitutions. There's a lot more general equilibrium, basically, in this economy than in the first one. We have to solve for the factor prices. From this year's propagation equation, exactly like for aggregate cost functions, we can work out the second order, the second derivatives, the matrix of second derivatives of the aggregate production function. It's going to summarize exactly the same information as the propagation equations. And it expresses these properties, again, as a function of these sufficient statistics, which are the network, degrees of returns to scale, the ability to reallocate factors, and the microeconomic elasticities of substitution. You can work out what the macro impact of microshocks is going to be from that, and macro moments, exactly like for shocks. And this is the universal energy example, again, The difference now is that instead of taking the prices of energy and labor as given, we're taking the quantity of energy and labor as given. And now you can imagine in this economy what happens when there's a negative shock to the production of energy. Again, think about an oil shock. And you see an expression here. The numerator is exactly the one that we encountered before. And the denominator is going to act like a multiplier. Why? Because there's a way to mitigate the impact of the shock that we had before and we don't have anymore. When you have an increase in the price of electricity in the economy that I had before, there was always the possibility of using more electricity, okay, to try to mitigate the impact of the shock. This is no longer possible. When you have a negative shock to the production of electricity, there's no way to increase the production of electricity. And so you get this term here, which is going to act as a very powerful multiplier. So you can get much bigger effects like, let's say, a negative shock to oil on aggregate output if you really do the general equilibrium via an aggregate production function. Just to show you another example, I'm not obsessed with energy. This is an example that's based on, it's trying to capture a capital bias technical change, so factor bias technical change, in a task-based models. So a task-based model is, we're taking inspiration here from a paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo. And the idea is, it's a very sort of simple form of disaggregated economy, where you say, look, aggregate output is produced from different tasks. We're going to produce the output of different tasks. Okay? And all these tasks are combined together to produce output according to a Cobb-Douglas aggregator. And then each task is going to be produced from capital and labor with some shares, omega k, omega ik and omega il. So these are the shares of capital and labor for this particular task. And then elasticity of substitution between capital and labor, theta kl. So think of theta kl as being relatively substitutable. Okay? In their example, it's actually infinite, but we're going to make it finite and greater than 1. So what you can do by applying the propagation equations that I showed you is get this characterization of the changes in the labor share and in the price of labor, in the wage, when you have a shock that features capital deepening at the micro level for a particular task. Okay, so there's capital bias technical change, AKK, for a particular task, little k. Okay, capital becomes more effective for this particular task. And the question is, what's the impact of this form of capital bias technical change on the labor share and on the wage? If you ask the same question in an economy with an aggregate production function of the standard form, let's say a CS between capital and labor, and you introduce capital bias technical change in the usual way, then you will get that when you have capital bias technical change, if capital and labor and substitutes, you're going to get an increase in the labor share, but you're always going to get an increase in the real wage. Okay, when capital becomes more effective, that's good for labor. In this economy, that's not necessarily good for labor in the sense that you can get both a decrease in the labor share and a decrease in the real wage. And I don't have time to explain exactly why that's happening, but it's very intuitive. The only thing I wanted to convey with this slide is this is a particular case of the sort of economies that we're working with. So you could think of embedding this vision of technical change in a task-based model in a much richer economy with input-output linkages. And this is sort of the right framework to think about that. You can do the same sort of characterizations that I did for cost functions for aggregate production functions. You can characterize macroeconomic elasticities of substitution between different factors. This is the formula that you would use to do that. And these Morishima elasticities of substitutions are going to have similar properties as for cost function. There's one difference, which is that the Morishima elasticity of substitution is no longer a linear weighted average of the underlying macroeconomic elasticities of substitution. It becomes a nonlinear function of these macroeconomic elasticities of substitution, but you still get this network irrelevance result if all the elasticities of substitutions are the same. Okay? So you can always circulate between aggregate cost and aggregate production function. There's a duality that works. And so if you know the shares propagation equation for one economy, you can work out what they are for the other and vice versa, and they encode the same information. Actually, in some cases, the duality is really sort of trivial. So if you have only one factor, then the aggregate cost function is the reciprocal of the aggregate production function. Okay, but you can always circulate between one and the other. Sometimes aggregate production function might be more convenient. Sometimes aggregate cost functions might be more convenient. So now let's go back, okay, with this framework to the Cambridge controversy. Okay? And what I'm going to try to do is to explain that there's a way to understand the lesson of the reswitching example, which looks like an exotic example, as the manifestation of the deep properties of this production function, which is that the network matters for the aggregate production function. So we're sort of like capturing the reswitching example of Samuelson exactly using our language, and this is what the network looks like. So I don't want you to understand what all these links mean, but basically the different nodes correspond to labor at different dates, and then the intermediates that are produced from labor at different dates and output at different dates. And the network is going to look something like this for the reswitching economy, and you have the two techniques. We're going to produce a slightly smoother example where you're going to substitute smoothly between the two techniques instead of switching very abruptly. Okay? And so what you get is a very similar picture as the one you got from the Samuelson reswitching example. In particular, you see that the capital output ratio is non-monotonic as a function of the interest rate. The capital labor ratio is also non-monotonic as a function of the interest rate. You get a violation of the neoclassical parables that Samuelson identified. Okay? So we replicate the reswitching example. And then the problem with basically the reason you cannot write f of KL, the reason you have a violation of the neoclassical parables is because the network matters. When you try to aggregate the different techniques, the different capital stocks into one number, okay, you're not respecting the structure of the network. You're changing this network. So it doesn't represent the same economy. And the aggregate production function does depend on the property of the network. So the reason I'm doing this is to explain that there's a deep property of aggregate production functions, which is that they depend on input-output linkages. They depend on the production networks. And there's a way to understand the reswitching example as a manifestation of this more general property, which ceases to be an exotic property. It's obvious that input-output linkages matter when you want to think about aggregate production function. So you can no longer say, oh, there's this quirky reswitching example. You know, I've shown you that aggregate production functions depend crucially on the input-output network, on input-output linkages, and it's something we need to take into account. So here's an application now, okay, and an application with numbers. So it's an application to a wonderful paper by Crucel et al., who's in Econometrica, who study the impact of the declining price of equipment, investment goods, on the skill premium in the presence of capital skill complementarities. So one thing that you see in the data is that the relative price of this particular form of investment, of equipment investment, is going down relatively quickly. Okay? So this investment is becoming cheaper. Okay, so it's a form of like embodied technical change that's embodied in new vintages of capital that's very powerful. And the idea of this paper is that if skilled labor is more complementary with capital than unskilled labor, then because we have this decrease in the price of capital, we're going to invest more. Because skilled labor is more complementary with capital, we're going to increase the price of skilled labor compared to the price of unskilled labor. So it's going to increase the skill premium. That's the logic of their application. Then they put numbers behind it, and they show that it's very important to explain why the skill premium has been rising for the past 2 or 3 decades. Okay? So what they do is they work with an aggregate production function. And this aggregate production function is of the constant elasticity of substitution type. It's a nested CES. And you have 2 nests. There's one nest between skilled labor and equipment capital. And there's a relatively low elasticity of substitution there. So there are complementarities. Okay. Then there's another nest between unskilled labor and that first nest between capital and unskilled labor with a relatively high elasticity of substitution. Now, the way they pick these elasticities of substitution is in two ways. But one of the ways is by motivating it from microeconomic studies. Okay, so you look at studies at the micro level that tries to estimate these elasticities of substitution, and you come up with numbers in that ballpark. They also do a macro estimation exercise, but that's not what I'm concerned with today. Now, what I want to do is to revisit this paper in a calibrated, disaggregated models, where I'm not going to postulate an aggregate production function. I'm going to work with 66 sectors and take into account the input-output linkages between these sectors. I'm going to assume the same microeconomic elasticities of substitution between factors as the ones that are identified by Krusell et al. In the paper, so 0.67 and 1.67. But I'm going to take into account the fact that the different sectors are also using the output of the other sector as an intermediate input. And I'm going to put different elasticities there. So there's going to be a 0.3 elasticities between value added, that's the factors, and intermediate goods. A 0.1 elasticity of substitution across intermediates. So when you try to substitute the inputs from one sector versus another sector, it's a very low elasticity of substitution, lots of complementarities, and there's considerable evidence that's the case in the data. And then I'm going to work with an elasticity of substitution that's relatively high, 0.6 in consumption. So I have this economy, and I can compute the aggregate production function, and in particular, the elasticities of substitution. So this is the matrix of elasticities of substitution. Let's focus on the production function for the disaggregated model versus the aggregated model. So we're looking at the left-hand side of these two panels. So you see that the numbers are different. And one line that I'm going to focus on is the line that starts with capital. Okay? So you would see here capital in non-college is an elasticity of substitution 1.04. Capital in college and elasticity of substitution 0.67. Okay? When you look at what happens in the disaggregated models, you see that the elasticities of substitutions are lower. Okay? So the 0.67 becomes 0.59. The 1.04 becomes 0.85. So we have in the disaggregated models, endogenously, we have lower elasticities of substitution between capital and the other two factors. And that's going to be very important for our findings. So we're motivating our exercise with the same microeconomic estimates as Krusell et al. Okay? But then we're embedding that to take into account the diversity of these sectors and their input-output linkages and the other elasticities of substitution. And we're finding that the aggregate elasticities of substitution between the factors are lower, substantially lower. Okay? This is showing you the sensitivity of these elasticities of substitution to the different elasticities. And you see that it's very sensitive to the inner nest, the 0.67, and it's very sensitive to some of the other elasticities as well. So these elasticities matter, okay? And so when you do robustness checks, you need to take into account that that's going to be the case. Now, let me show you, because I'm running out of time, just this exercise. So I'm going to replicate in my economy the exercise that Krusell et al. Do, which is I'm going to assume that this reduction in the relative price of investment goods that took place from the 1970s onwards did not take place. Okay? So in the world, what happened is this price of investment declined. As a result, there was a lot of investment. I'm going to assume that that did not take place. As a result, there will not be that investment. Capital is going to be lower. Okay? Now, here are the log changes in factor shares, and I'm going to compare the aggregate model that Krusell et al. Were working with and the disaggregated model. So you see that these shares change very differently. Because there are more complementarities in the disaggregated model, there's a bigger increase in the capital share, okay? And there's a bigger decrease in the share of skilled labor if that shock didn't take place, okay? So you see that we get very different movements in the shares in that counterfactual. Now, it turns out that if you're focused on the skilled premium, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Okay, so in the counterfactual, the shares are going to be changing very differently. The capital share would be a lot higher. The shares of the other two factors of skilled labor and unskilled labor would be a lot lower. But when you look at the risk premium, the two numbers come out relatively comparable. Okay, so that would have an impact of something like 20% on the skill premium. So again, if that change in the relative price of investment goods did not take place, the skill premium would be 20% lower. And that's true in both the aggregated model and disaggregated model. But this similarity, okay, it stops there. If you want to know what happens to the different factor shares in that counterfactual, they move very differently. So there's one message in this, which is that disaggregation matters for some questions and matter less for others. There's no general theorem that tells you when it's going to be important. And in particular, there's no a priori way of knowing whether you are committing a big crime by working with an aggregate production function or a small crime. You see that here would be a small crime for the skill premium, but a big crime for the factor shares. But that's not a universal answer, okay? So it matters for something, it matters less for others, and there's no way to know a priori. So it's important to disaggregate, basically. This is one of the graphs I promised you that's sort of documenting with numbers this oil example. So we're taking the model, and oil is one of the sectors, and retail is another one. It turns out that oil and retail have approximately the same size. They have similar sales shares. So up to the first order, a negative shock to retail and negative shock to oil should have the same impact. And these are these two dotted lines. Sorry, yeah. Okay? But you see that if you have a negative shock to oil, okay, a big negative shock to oil, that has a much bigger impact on the economy than a big negative shock to retail. And the reason for that, okay, is that oil has a very special position in the network. Oil enters everywhere. It's a universal input. Retail is not. There's a possibility to substitute away from retail. There's no possibility, or much less, to substitute away from oil at the macro level. As a result, when you have a negative shock to oil, the output falls off the cliff compared to retail. So there are much more nonlinearities for oil than for retail. And this is showing you why maybe oil is very special, and why negative shock to oil can have a very big impact on the economy despite its relatively small size. And you really need to disaggregate in order to see that. It's due to the position of oil in the network that will produce a low aggregate elasticity of substitution for oil. This is showing you actual data. It's not even a model anymore. So this is the sales share of oil as a response of the two oil shocks. So you see it like spiking from something like 2% to close to 8% at the end of the 70s as a response to the oil shock. And this is showing you that there are complementarities at the macro level. This is illustrating the logic I was showing you before, that a big negative shock to oil is going to have a big impact on output because the share of oil is going to go up a lot. There's a lot of nonlinearities. And you can actually compute it. So to the first order, the effect of this oil shock would be something like 0.2%, and the second order multiplies it by 3. That's something like 0.6% of world GDP. So it's a huge number. The distribution of GDP is going to look very different when you have nonlinearities. This is showing you the blue curve versus the red curve. So that's also something that you can see only when you disaggregate, and it's going to depend on the size of the shocks, because these nonlinearities are going to be more important when the shocks are bigger. And so that's the difference between the left graph and the right graph. We have a way also of doing frictions and distortions that I did not have time to present, and I don't have time to present. But I'll say the following, which is when you have economies with frictions and distortions, okay, the thing that's robust is really the propagation equation. Okay, they transform very continuously with the introduction of frictions. You can still characterize aggregate production functions, but it's harder when you have distortions. It's also less useful because the properties of the aggregate production functions are divorced from the properties of the changes in the factor shares. You no longer have that the marginal product of a factor is equal to that factor share, for example. So it's more difficult and less useful to characterize aggregate production function in that context. And we think it's much more natural to move directly to the propagation equations in these economies. Okay, so just to conclude, We picked up where the Cambridge controversy left. I tried to explain that it's important to disaggregate, that the reswitching example of Samuelson is the manifestation. It's not an exotic thing, it's the manifestation of a deeper, more fundamental properties of aggregate production function, which is that the network matters. This theory has many, many applications to the skill premium, to the behavior of labor and capital shares, to technical change in task-based models, to models of sectoral transformation, trade theorems. And it's a big research agenda that I'm pursuing with David. And we have a couple of papers already and a lot more work to do, and a lot of other people are working on this, and it's a very exciting area of research.